The cameras were rolling, the world was watching, and millions of people were tuned in to what was supposed to be just another royal appearance. But sometimes, the most powerful moments come from the smallest voices. Sometimes, a single sentence from a child can shake the very foundations of tradition, challenge centuries of protocol, and remind us all of what truly matters. What happened next would be replayed on news channels around the globe, shared millions of times on social media, and talked about in living rooms from London to Tokyo. The little prince, barely old enough to tie his own shoes, was about to say something that would leave his parents stunned, his security team scrambling, and the entire world asking the same question: did he really just say that? This is the story of how one authentic moment from the youngest member of the British royal family changed everything we thought we knew about royalty, childhood, and the power of speaking truth in a world full of careful words and practiced smiles. The morning sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds of the Children's Hospital as the royal convoy pulled through the gates. Prince William adjusted his tie one last time while Catherine smoothed down her dress, both of them going through the familiar mental checklist that preceded every public appearance. Behind them, their 3 children sat in careful formation, each dressed impeccably for what was supposed to be a routine visit to open the hospital's new wing. Prince George, now 11 years old, had mastered the art of royal composure. His shoulders were straight, his expression appropriately serious for the occasion. Princess Charlotte, 9, fidgeted slightly with her small handbag but maintained the poise that had been carefully cultivated through years of public appearances. And, then, there was Prince Louis. At 5 years old, Louis represented something that the royal family had rarely experienced in recent generations: complete unpredictability. While his siblings had learned to navigate the complex world of royal protocol, Louis remained refreshingly, sometimes alarmingly, authentic. His parents had learned to expect the unexpected, but they could never quite prepare for what might come out of his mouth. The hospital staff had been preparing for this visit for months. Every detail had been planned, from the route the royal family would take through the building to the specific children they would meet. The new pediatric wing represented a significant advancement in children's healthcare, featuring state-of-the-art equipment and specialized treatment rooms designed specifically for young patients. As the family emerged from their vehicle, the familiar choreography of a royal visit began. Security personnel took their positions, photographers adjusted their lenses, and hospital administrators straightened their name tags one final time. Catherine bent down to whisper something in Louis's ear, likely a gentle reminder about staying close and using his best manners. The hospital's chief executive, Dr. Margaret Thompson, had been practicing her greeting for weeks. She approached the family with the measured confidence of someone who had spent her entire career working with children but had never quite dealt with royal children. The initial pleasantries went smoothly, handshakes were exchanged, welcoming words were spoken, and the family was introduced to the key staff members who would guide them through the visit. What struck Dr. Thompson immediately was how normal the family seemed despite their extraordinary circumstances. William's genuine interest in the hospital's work was evident as he asked detailed questions about the new facilities. Catherine's ease with children was natural and unforced as she knelt down to speak with young patients at their eye level. George and Charlotte followed their parents' lead, offering shy smiles and polite responses to the adults they met. But Louis was different. While his family moved through the carefully orchestrated visit, he seemed to be absorbing everything around him with an intensity that was unusual for a 5-year-old. His eyes darted from the medical equipment to the colorful murals on the walls, from the faces of the sick children to the expressions of the adults who surrounded them. The tour began in the reception area, where a small group of patients and their families had been selected to meet the royal visitors. The children, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, had been carefully chosen to represent the diversity of conditions treated at the hospital. Some were in wheelchairs, others had visible medical devices, and a few showed no outward signs of illness but were dealing with serious conditions nonetheless. As the family moved through the reception area, something shifted in Louis's demeanor. The excitement that had characterized his early moments of the visit began to transform into something more thoughtful. He watched as his mother knelt beside a little girl who was connected to a portable oxygen tank, her thin face lighting up as Catherine asked about her drawings. He observed his father's conversation with a teenage boy who had lost his hair due to chemotherapy treatments, noting how his dad's usual formal tone softened into something more personal and caring. The group moved into the new treatment wing, where the most advanced medical equipment had been installed. The rooms were designed to be as welcoming as possible, with bright colors and cheerful decorations that attempted to mask the serious nature of the work that would be done there. Interactive screens allowed young patients to play games during treatments, while special lighting systems could simulate different environments to help ease anxiety. It was in one of these treatment rooms that Lewis encountered something that would stay with him for the rest of the day. A young boy named Marcus, who couldn't have been much older than Lewis himself, was receiving treatment for a rare blood disorder. Despite his condition, Marcus had insisted on staying to meet the royal family, though he was clearly tired and uncomfortable. When Catherine approached Marcus's bedside, the little boy's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. He had prepared questions to ask the princess, had practiced what he would say, and had even drawn a picture that he hoped to give her. The interaction was sweet and genuine, with Catherine taking time to examine the drawing carefully and ask Marcus about each colorful detail. But it was Lewis who seemed most affected by the encounter. While his parents and siblings continued their conversations with the medical staff, Lewis remained focused on Marcus. He noticed how the other boy tried to hide his discomfort, how he smiled even when it was clear he wasn't feeling well, and how his eyes seemed both hopeful and tired at the same time. The official tour continued through several more areas of the hospital. The family visited the new surgical suite, where they were shown some of the robotic equipment that would allow for more precise procedures. They toured the family accommodation area, where parents could stay close to their children during extended treatments. They saw the therapeutic play areas designed to help young patients continue their emotional and social development even while dealing with serious medical conditions. Throughout the visit, the adults focused on the technical achievements and medical advances that the new wing represented. They discussed funding, treatment protocols, and the impact the facility would have on children's healthcare in the region. The conversations were important and substantive, but they remained largely abstract, focused on systems and statistics rather than the individual human experiences that gave those numbers meaning. Lewis, however, seemed to be having a completely different experience. While the adults talked about treatment outcomes and medical innovations, he was noticing things that the grown-ups seemed to miss. He saw the way some children tried to appear braver than they felt. He noticed how parents hovered nearby with expressions that mixed hope and worry in equal measure. He observed the gentle patience of the nurses and the careful way they explained procedures to young patients. As the visit progressed, Lewis became increasingly quiet. This was unusual for a child who typically filled any available silence with questions, observations, or commentary. His parents noticed the change but attributed it to the overwhelming nature of the environment. Hospital visits could be intense even for adults, and they assumed their youngest son was simply processing all the new sights and sounds. The planned itinerary included one final stop, a meeting with the hospital's board of directors and major donors in a conference room decorated for the occasion. This was typically the most formal part of such visits, where official photographs would be taken and speeches would be given. It was also usually the point where young royal children would begin to show signs of fatigue or restlessness. As the family entered the conference room, Lewis suddenly stopped walking. His parents, engaged in conversation with the hospital administrators, didn't immediately notice that their youngest son was no longer beside them. When Catherine turned to check on him, she found Lewis standing in the doorway, his small face wearing an expression she had never seen before. The room fell silent as everyone realized that something was happening. Lewis looked around at all the adults, the hospital board members in their formal attire, the photographers with their expensive equipment, the royal protection officers standing at attention, and his own family dressed in their public appearance best. What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world, shared millions of times on social media, and analyzed by royal watchers for years to come. But, in that moment, none of the adults in the room could have predicted what the 5-year-old prince was about to say. The silence stretched on as Lewis seemed to gather his thoughts. His parents exchanged glances, uncertain whether to prompt him to speak or gently guide him into the room. The hospital officials waited respectfully, unsure of the protocol for such a situation. The photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that something significant was about to happen. When Lewis finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice was clear and carried easily across the quiet room. What he said was so unexpected, so profound in its simplicity, and so completely honest that it left every adult present struggling to find an appropriate response. The little prince, who had spent the morning observing a world that most children his age would never see, was about to share an observation that would challenge everything the adults thought they knew about children, about suffering, and about what really mattered in life. His words hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront truths they had been carefully avoiding. In that moment, Prince Louis proved that sometimes the most important insights come not from years of education or professional experience, but from the unfiltered honesty of a child who sees the world exactly as it is. The silence in the conference room was complete. Every eye was fixed on the small figure standing in the doorway, his royal blue blazer crisp and formal, but his expression anything but ceremonial. Prince Louis looked around the room once more, taking in the expectant faces of the adults who were waiting to hear what he had to say. When he finally spoke, his words were delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that only children possess, free from the careful calculation that adults apply to their public statements. Why do all the sick children have to pretend they're happy when they're really scared and sad? The question landed in the room like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembled adults. It was not the kind of comment that royal protocol had prepared anyone to handle. There was no official response for such raw honesty, no practiced smile that could adequately address the profound observation of a 5-year-old who had spent the morning seeing things that adults had trained themselves to overlook. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. As a mother, she was accustomed to her children's ability to cut through pretense with startling clarity, but this was different. This was her youngest son, in front of cameras and dignitaries, asking a question that exposed something uncomfortable about the very nature of their visit. William's mind raced as he processed what Louis had said. His son hadn't asked why children got sick, or why the hospital needed better equipment, or any of the questions that might have been expected from a child touring a medical facility. Instead, Louis had identified something much more complex and troubling: the performance aspect of suffering, the way even very sick children felt pressure to appear brave and cheerful for the benefit of their visitors. Dr. Thompson, who had spent decades working with pediatric patients, found herself struggling to formulate a response. In her professional experience, she had seen exactly what Louis was describing countless times. Children who were frightened or in pain would summon smiles when adults approached, understanding instinctively that their job was to reassure the grown-ups around them rather than express their true feelings. The photographers in the room faced an unprecedented situation. They had been positioned to capture the ceremonial moments of the visit: handshakes, ribbon cuttings, and formal group photos. But what was happening now felt too private, too profound to reduce to a media opportunity. Several of them lowered their cameras entirely, sensing that some moments were not meant to be turned into headlines. Louis wasn't finished. Having asked his initial question, he seemed compelled to continue sharing his observations from the morning. Marcus was trying really hard not to cry when the doctor was talking to his mom. And the girl with no hair was smiling, but her hands were shaking. Why don't grown-ups see that? The second question was even more challenging than the first. It wasn't just an observation about the children's behavior, it was an indictment of the adults' ability to truly see and acknowledge the reality of what these young patients were experiencing. Louis had identified a fundamental disconnect between the public face of pediatric healthcare and the private emotional reality of childhood illness. George and Charlotte stood frozen beside their parents, uncertain how to react to their brother's unexpected commentary. They had been taught to follow scripts during public appearances, to say appropriate things at appropriate times. Louis was clearly operating outside any script, and they watched with a mixture of admiration and anxiety as he continued to speak truths that everyone could hear but no one seemed prepared to address. A board member, attempting to restore some semblance of normal conversation, stepped forward with what he hoped would be a diplomatic response. "Well, Your Highness, children are remarkably resilient, and we find that maintaining a positive atmosphere helps with their recovery." Louis looked at the man with the penetrating gaze that children often direct at adults when they sense they're being given incomplete or unsatisfactory answers. But if they can't say when they're scared, how do you know how to help them feel better? The question revealed a level of emotional intelligence that was startling in someone so young. Louis had identified not just the existence of performed happiness among the sick children, but the practical problem it created for their care.
If children felt obligated to hide their true feelings, how could the adults around them provide appropriate emotional support?
Catherine found her voice first, kneeling down to Louis's eye level as she had done with the children they had met earlier.
You're absolutely right, sweetheart.
It is important for children to be able to share their real feelings.
What made you think about this?
The question opened a floodgate of observations that Louis had apparently been storing up throughout the morning. He talked about Marcus trying to hide his tears, about the teenage girl who had laughed at her father's jokes even though she looked tired, about the little boy who had insisted he wasn't scared of his upcoming surgery even though his voice was shaking. What emerged from Louis's commentary was a detailed portrait of childhood courage that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the burden of protecting the adults around them. These children, dealing with serious illnesses and frightening treatments, had somehow absorbed the message that their job was to make everyone else feel better about their situation.
Dr.
Thompson found herself thinking about her own interactions with patients throughout the years. How many times had she accepted a child's brave smile at face value because it was easier than acknowledging their fear? How many opportunities for deeper connection and support had been missed because everyone involved was participating in a collective pretense that everything was fine? The hospital's child psychologist, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, stepped forward. Dr. Sarah Chen had dedicated her career to understanding the emotional needs of young patients, and she recognized the profound accuracy of Louis's observations. "Your Highness," she said, addressing Louis directly, "you've noticed something very important that many adults miss. Children often feel like they need to protect the grown-ups around them, even when they're the ones who need protection." Louis nodded seriously, as if grateful that at least one adult was taking his observations seriously. The boy Marcus whispered to his teddy bear when he thought no one was looking. He told the bear he was scared about the big machine they were going to use tomorrow.
Why couldn't he tell his mom instead? The specificity of Louis's observation stunned everyone in the room.
He hadn't just noticed general patterns of behavior, he had been paying attention to individual moments of vulnerability, seeing the private ways children coped with their fears when they thought no one was watching. William realized that his son had experienced something during this visit that none of the adults had anticipated. While they had focused on the medical achievements and institutional accomplishments, Louis had been having a profound encounter with human suffering and resilience. He had seen behind the carefully maintained facade of pediatric healthcare to witness the real emotional experiences of children facing serious illness.
The implications of Louis's observations began to sink in for everyone present. If a 5-year-old could identify these patterns of emotional performance among sick children, what did that say about the adults who worked with these patients every day? How had professional healthcare providers become so accustomed to children's brave facades that they no longer questioned whether those smiles reflected genuine feelings? Catherine found herself thinking about her own children's experiences with public appearances. How many times had she coached them to smile and wave even when they were tired or overwhelmed? Was she inadvertently teaching them the same lessons about emotional performance that seemed to be affecting the sick children Louis had observed? The room remained quiet as everyone processed what they had heard. Louis's questions had exposed something uncomfortable about the intersection of childhood, illness, and social expectations. His observations challenged fundamental assumptions about resilience, bravery, and the role of positive thinking in pediatric healthcare. A nurse who had been part of the tour, Sister Mary Catherine, spoke up from the back of the room. She had been working with children for over 30 years and recognized the truth in Louis's words. "The young prince is absolutely right," she said quietly. "Children do try to protect us from their fears. And sometimes we let them because it's easier for us to believe they're okay." Her admission created a ripple of recognition through the room. Other staff members began to nod, acknowledging their own experiences with patients who had performed happiness for their benefit. The conversation that Louis had initiated was beginning to open up space for a more honest discussion about the emotional realities of pediatric healthcare. Louis, perhaps sensing that his words had created some kind of breakthrough, continued with the relentless honesty that characterized his age. "I think the grown-ups are scared too. That's why they like it when children pretend everything is okay. But maybe if everyone could say they were scared together, it wouldn't be so scary anymore." This final observation left everyone in the room speechless once again.
The 5-year-old prince had not only identified the children's emotional performance but had also recognized the underlying reason for it, the adult's own discomfort with fear and vulnerability. He had seen through the entire elaborate system of mutual protection that everyone had been participating in without even realizing it.
The wisdom contained in Lewis's simple statement about shared fear was profound.
If children felt safe enough to express their true feelings, and if adults could acknowledge their own fears and uncertainties, perhaps the entire experience of childhood illness could be transformed into something more honest and, ultimately, more healing. As the implications of the young prince's words continued to resonate through the room, it became clear that this hospital visit had become something entirely unexpected. What had begun as a ceremonial opening had transformed into a moment of genuine revelation, sparked by the unguarded observations of a child who had seen what everyone else had learned not to notice. The silence that followed Lewis's observation about shared fear was different from the previous moments of quiet in the room. This wasn't the awkward pause of adults unsure how to respond to an unexpected comment from a child. This was the profound stillness that comes when a fundamental truth has been spoken and everyone present is beginning to understand its implications. Dr. Thompson was the first to fully grasp what was happening. In her decades of experience running pediatric facilities, she had attended hundreds of meetings, ribbon cuttings, and ceremonial events. She had given countless tours to dignitaries, politicians, and celebrities. But she had never experienced anything like what was unfolding in this conference room, where a 5-year-old prince was conducting an impromptu masterclass on the emotional dynamics of childhood illness. "Your Highness," Dr. Thompson said, addressing Lewis directly with a respect typically reserved for adult dignitaries, "would you be willing to help us understand something? When you were talking with the children today, did any of them seem like they wanted to tell you how they were really feeling?" Lewis considered the question seriously, his small face scrunched in concentration. Marcus wanted to tell someone about the nightmare he had last night about the big scanning machine. And the girl Charlotte, not my sister, the other Charlotte, she wanted to ask if her hair would grow back the same color, but she was worried it would make her mom cry if she asked. The specificity of these observations stunned everyone present. Lewis hadn't just been making casual conversation with the young patients, he had been truly listening to them in a way that apparently few adults had done. He had picked up on unspoken fears and unasked questions that the children were carrying alone. Catherine found herself thinking about her own interactions during the visit. She had focused on being warm and encouraging, asking about the children's hobbies and interests, trying to bring moments of joy to their difficult circumstances. But had she created space for them to share their real concerns? Had her well-intentioned positivity inadvertently contributed to the very dynamic that Lewis was describing? William was wrestling with larger implications. As someone who would one day be king, he had been trained from childhood to understand the power of public appearances and carefully managed messaging. But his youngest son was demonstrating a completely different kind of leadership, one based on genuine connection and uncomfortable honesty rather than reassuring performance. The hospital's social worker, Jennifer Martinez, stepped forward from where she had been observing near the windows. She worked specifically with families dealing with long-term pediatric illnesses and recognized the profound accuracy of Lewis's insights. "Prince Louis, in my job, I try to help children talk about their feelings when they're in the hospital. But you're right that many children feel like they need to protect the adults around them. What do you think would help them feel safer to share their real feelings?" Lewis didn't hesitate in his response. "Maybe if the grown-ups said they were worried too, instead of always saying everything will be fine. When my dad gets worried about something, he tells us, and then we can be worried together, and then we figure out what to do. But if he pretended nothing was wrong, I would have to pretend too, and then neither of us could fix anything." The simple logic of his statement hit everyone in the room with unexpected force. Lewis had articulated something that child psychologists and family therapists spent years trying to teach parents and healthcare providers. Authentic emotional connection required vulnerability from adults, not just children. If grown-ups insisted on maintaining facades of unwavering optimism, they inadvertently forced children to match that performance rather than express their genuine experiences. Dr. Chen, the child psychologist, found herself taking notes as Lewis spoke. This wasn't standard protocol for a royal visit, but nothing about this conversation was following standard protocol.
Prince Louis, you've made some very important observations today. Has anyone ever taught you these things about feelings and being honest about them?
My mom and dad talk to us about feelings all the time, Louis replied matter-of-factly. They say it's okay to be sad or scared or angry, and that talking about feelings doesn't make them worse, it makes them smaller.
But I think maybe the sick children don't know that their grown-ups think the same way.
Catherine felt a complex mixture of pride and concern as she listened to her son. On one hand, she was gratified that the emotional lessons she and William tried to teach their children at home were clearly taking root. On the other hand, she was realizing that Louis was applying those lessons to situations far more complex and challenging than typical childhood experiences. The board members who had been expecting a routine ceremonial event found themselves in the midst of what was essentially an impromptu consultation on pediatric psychological care. Several of them began taking their own notes, recognizing that the insights emerging from this conversation could fundamentally change how their institution approached emotional support for young patients.
Sister Mary Catherine, the veteran nurse, spoke up again.
In all my years working with children in hospital, I've never heard anyone explain it quite like that, Your Highness. You've helped me understand something I've been seeing but not really recognizing. Many of our young patients do seem to be protecting us from their fears.
Louis nodded seriously.
When George broke his arm last year, he was really scared about getting the cast, but he didn't want to tell Mom and Dad because they were already worried. But when Dad said he was nervous about watching the doctor fix George's arm, then George could say he was nervous too, and then they could be nervous together and it wasn't so scary anymore.
The parallels between Louis's family experience and the hospital environment were becoming increasingly clear to everyone in the room.
The prince was essentially describing a model for authentic emotional communication that could be applied to pediatric healthcare. If medical staff and family members could acknowledge their own concerns and uncertainties, it might create space for children to express their feelings more honestly. Dr. Thompson found herself reconsidering fundamental aspects of how her hospital approached patient care. The institutional emphasis on maintaining positive attitudes and focusing on successful outcomes was well-intentioned, but Louis was revealing how that approach might inadvertently silence the very people it was meant to help.
Prince Louis, she said, if you were in charge of a hospital like this one, what would you do differently to help children feel more comfortable sharing their real feelings?
The question was remarkable in itself, a senior hospital administrator asking a 5-year-old for policy recommendations. But the conversation had moved far beyond normal boundaries, and everyone present seemed to recognize that Louis's insights were genuinely valuable regardless of his age.
Louis thought carefully before responding.
I think I would have special rooms where children could go to be sad or scared without anyone trying to make them feel better right away.
Sometimes you just need to feel sad for a little bit before you're ready to feel better.
And I think all the grown-ups should wear name tags that say what they're worried about today, so children know it's okay to be worried too. The suggestions were simultaneously childlike in their simplicity and sophisticated in their understanding of emotional dynamics. The idea of creating dedicated spaces for processing difficult emotions was actually quite advanced from a therapeutic perspective. And the concept of adults modeling emotional honesty through visible displays of their own concerns was exactly the kind of vulnerability that research showed could help children feel safer expressing their authentic feelings. Jennifer Martinez, the social worker, found herself genuinely excited by Louis's suggestions.
Those are really thoughtful ideas, Prince Louis. Have you ever thought about what would help parents feel more comfortable being honest about their worries when their children are sick? Maybe they need a special room too, Louis replied without hesitation.
And maybe someone could explain to them that children can handle knowing that grown-ups are worried, because children are worried too, so at least they could be worried together instead of alone. The profound emotional intelligence contained in this statement left several adults in the room visibly moved. Louis had identified not just the children's need for authentic emotional expression, but also the parallel need of parents and caregivers who were often struggling with their own fears while trying to maintain brave faces for their children. As the conversation continued, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. A royal visit that had been planned as a standard ceremonial event was transforming into a genuine consultation on pediatric psychological care, led by a 5-year-old who had demonstrated remarkable insight into human nature and emotional dynamics. The implications extended far beyond this single hospital visit. If Lewis's observations were accurate, and the recognition on the faces of the healthcare professionals suggested they were, then pediatric medical care across the country, possibly around the world, might need to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about resilience, positivity, and emotional support for young patients. Word of what was happening in the conference room had begun to spread to hospital staff who weren't part of the original tour. Nurses, doctors, and therapists found reasons to pass by the room, curious about why the scheduled visit was running so far behind time and why they could hear such intense discussion coming from what should have been a brief photo opportunity. The photographer who had been assigned to document the visit found himself in an unprecedented situation. The images he was capturing showed a 5-year-old prince engaged in what appeared to be a serious professional consultation with senior medical staff. These weren't the typical ceremonial photos that usually emerged from royal hospital visits. This was documentation of something entirely new and unexpected. As Lewis continued to share his observations and suggestions, the adults in the room began to realize that they were witnessing something that would likely be talked about for years to come. This wasn't just an unusual moment in a routine royal engagement. This was a child who had seen through the elaborate social constructions that adults had built around childhood illness and was offering insights that could genuinely improve how society approached some of its most vulnerable members. The conversation was far from over, but already it was clear that nothing would be quite the same after Prince Louis had asked his simple, devastating question about why sick children had to pretend to be happy when they were really scared and sad. What happened next was something that no one in the conference room could have predicted. Dr. Thompson, who had spent the last 30 minutes listening to a 5-year-old prince deliver insights that challenged everything she thought she knew about pediatric care, made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire hospital visit. "Prince Louis," she said, her voice carrying a weight of professional respect that surprised even herself, "would you be willing to come back and talk with some of the children you met today? I think they might benefit from hearing what you shared with us, and I suspect you might learn even more from talking with them directly." The suggestion was unprecedented. Royal visits were carefully choreographed affairs with predetermined schedules and outcomes. The idea of extending a visit based on the insights of a 5-year-old, and specifically to facilitate conversations between young patients and a member of the royal family about fear and emotional honesty, was not covered in any protocol manual. William and Catherine exchanged glances, both of them recognizing that they were in uncharted territory. Their instinct as parents was to protect Louis from taking on emotional burdens that seemed too heavy for someone his age. But they had also witnessed something remarkable happening throughout this conversation, and they could see that Louis wasn't being overwhelmed by the complexity of what he was discussing, he was thriving in it. "I would like that very much," Louis replied, his voice carrying a seriousness that seemed to belong to someone much older. "But, can I ask the grown-ups to promise something first?" Dr. Thompson nodded. "Of course, Your Highness. What would you like us to promise? Can you promise not to try to make everyone feel better if they say they're scared or sad? Sometimes grown-ups hear that children are worried and they immediately start saying things like 'don't worry' or 'everything will be fine.' But that makes children think they shouldn't have said they were worried in the first place." The request demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that left the healthcare professionals in the room genuinely impressed. Louis had identified one of the most common mistakes that well-meaning adults make when children express difficult emotions, the impulse to immediately offer reassurance rather than first acknowledging and validating the child's experience. Dr. Chen, the child psychologist, found herself nodding enthusiastically. "That's an excellent point, Prince Louis. In my training, we call it emotional bypassing when adults skip over acknowledging someone's feelings and jump straight to trying to fix them. You're absolutely right that it can make children feel like their emotions aren't acceptable." "Exactly," Louis said, seeming pleased that an adult understood what he was describing. "If someone says they're scared about having surgery tomorrow, maybe the grown-up could say that sounds really scary before they say, but the doctors are very good. Because both things can be true, surgery can be scary and doctors can be good at the same time." The practical wisdom contained in this statement was remarkable. Louis had articulated a fundamental principle of emotional support, that acknowledging difficult feelings doesn't negate positive realities, and that rushing to optimism without first validating someone's experience can actually make them feel more isolated and misunderstood. Sister Mary Catherine, who had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement, spoke up. Your Highness, in 30 years of nursing, I don't think I've ever heard anyone explain that quite so clearly. You've helped me understand why some of my patients seem to withdraw when I try to encourage them. I think I've been doing exactly what you're describing, trying to fix their feelings instead of first letting them know their feelings make sense. The admission was both brave and profound. A senior nursing professional was acknowledging that a 5-year-old had taught her something fundamental about her own practice. The moment represented exactly the kind of authentic vulnerability that Lewis had been advocating for throughout the conversation. Dr. Thompson looked around the room at her staff, recognizing that something transformational was happening not just for the children they served, but for the professionals who cared for them. Prince Louis, if we arrange for you to speak with some of our patients, would you be comfortable if some of our staff members listened as well? I think they could learn a great deal from hearing how you talk with the children. Lewis considered this request seriously. Will the doctors and nurses be allowed to say if they're worried about something too? Because I think it would help everyone if the grown-ups could be honest about their feelings, just like they want the children to be honest about theirs. The suggestion was radical in the context of professional medical environments. Healthcare providers were typically trained to project confidence and competence to reassure patients and families through their apparent certainty and control. The idea of medical staff openly acknowledging their own uncertainties and concerns was contrary to most professional training. But Dr. Thompson found herself seriously considering the proposal. What if the emotional distance that professionals maintained in the name of reassuring patients was actually creating barriers to authentic connection and healing? What if Lewis was right that shared vulnerability could be more therapeutic than performed confidence? That's a very interesting idea, Prince Louis. What would that look like, do you think? Lewis didn't hesitate. Maybe before they ask children how they're feeling.